first to welcome to welcome. Oh, I'm sorry, my computer is now. I'm sorry. Hi everyone. We would like to welcome everyone present at this event. Thank you, Professor Grish, to make this happen. Also, especially Anima. Anima, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this space and to be able to carry out this conversation. This event is the result of a collaboration between Ethnolab and the Department of Anthropology Graduate Professionalization Committee. So now Anima is introduce themselves for us. Thank you, Anima.
So I'm going to just start first, I guess, because I'm going to basically introduce Anima first, and then they will also go on to introduce themselves. So, hi, my name is Girish Daswani. My pronouns are he, him. I'm an associate professor at the University of Toronto here at the Takaronto, which is the dish with one spoon territory and the home to many indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, the Huron, the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I would like to also acknowledge that the University of Toronto has been and has been for a long time a settler colonial university. So I am happy to be here to co-host and to also have this conversation with Dr. Anima Adjepong. I first met Dr. Anima Adjepong when they chaired a panel that I co-organized with Dr. Wunpini Fatimata Mohammed called Queer Feminist Organizing in Ghana and Beyond. Now, their role as facilitator, but also events co-organizer as a member of Silent Majority Ghana was crucial for steering the dialogue that followed. But what struck me was their definition of what they call transnational queer feminist activism that eloquently described and spoke to the spirit, I believe, of this conversation. And when breaking that phrase down, Anima described, and I'm definitely paraphrasing here, transnational, how it implicates colonial histories, but also allows us to think beyond its borders. Queer is a politics, not just an identity that engages with structures of power. And feminist activism is the work of undoing patriarchy. Now, I just open with that to share with you the previous conversations that led me to not just inviting Anima, but also I've used their book in my undergraduate class, and I recommend their book called Afropolitan Projects, Redefining Blackness, Sexualities, and Culture from Houston to Accra, which has been published by the University of North Carolina Press and came out in 2021. I'm not going to go on to introduce them, which they'll do for themselves, but I do want to say that I have a few questions and I invite you to ask questions once we invite you as well. So Anima, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Girish, and thank you, Lara. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, and yes, I'm looking forward to all the questions that will come up. But I wanted to begin by maybe offering a little bit of context for myself and how I think about myself as someone who, it's weird to say like scholar activist. So hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that. But as I was kind of thinking, okay, so how do I introduce myself in this context? I began by realizing that my academic bio describes me as someone who researches, writes, and teaches about identity, culture, and social change. And as someone who's particularly interested in how cultural struggles can bring about transformation. What this biography obscures is my own particular interest in liberation for myself, right? So there's this kind of like neat way in which we talk about like what it means to be a scholar, and we even though I think so often like there's the aphorism that the personal is political, and we understand that, but I don't think in our more kind of sanitized professional settings we amplify that so much. But I began to think about when I first started doing ethnographic research. I was fresh out of undergrad, and I was interested in this question of gender and gender expansiveness. And I had no training. My undergraduate work was in comparative literature. So it's not like I fully knew what ethnography was. I was learning by reading a lot and by doing. But when I had that question, when I kind of entered this work as a student, I was studying gender in a very kind of intellectual, curious way. And at the same time, I was involved in other kinds of feminist organizing. I was doing that through my undergraduate work, et cetera. But there wasn't like a streamlined integration between the different kinds of organizing and activism that I was involved in and my intellectual work. It wasn't really until I was doing the research for my book, Afropolitan Projects, that this kind of moment crystallized for me in terms of how my kind of intellectual orientation could shape that transformation. And I think there's a way in which this sounds a bit silly, but what I'm really trying to say is that my activism and scholarship were not integrated. So yes, I was doing scholarship through a particular perspective, right? It was a perspective that was anti-colonial, it was queer, it was African, it was feminist. And I was integrating all of those things together as a queer African feminist. But I was not consciously aligning the different kinds of social change projects that I was doing into my scholarship. And I want to say that, like, I'm only 5 or 6 years out of my PhD, right? So for a long time, I was also doing my PhD, which is not, at least for me, like that's where my energy was. I was involved in different kinds of organizing work. For example, I think this space is a space for organizing in terms of the ethnography lab. When I was in graduate school, I was also part of an ethnography lab, but a lot of my primary work was in organizing the race and ethnicity working group, where we were kind of involved in academic activism, right? Really kind of challenging sociology's ideas around race, which continue to be a bit, I don't know, retrogressive, and kind of pushing for a more intentional racial analysis towards the center of the discipline. And I also did some things with the sociologist for trans justice, but this was not like, this was not taking up the majority of my time. However, when I was doing the research for my book, something really crystallized for me. And I think that is what I would then say spurred my position into what you might call a scholar activist or an activist scholar. And I'm not even sure which one precedes the other. But in the course of writing my book, I really came to understand hegemony on a very visceral level, right? So there's I think this happens to a lot of people, where we have an intellectual understanding of something, and then all of a sudden it like drops down into the body and it spurs action. That's how it was for me. I really understood in this very clear way how silence and power and fear were shaping the opportunities and possibilities for queer freedom in Ghana. And when that happened, it also happened at the same time that I was understanding all of these different social, political, and cultural structures that could then, for me, help me be confident about making some particular actions. And so this is how Silent Majority came about. It came through this deep study and this deep understanding of the landscape based on the research. And so it's like the scholarship informs the activism, and then the activism continues to inform the scholarship, and there's this kind of iterative relationship. But I just wanted to kind of lay that out as a little bit of where I'm coming from and how I'm engaging in this work.
Thanks, Anima. I guess what I hear from what you're saying is also that there was the activism and there was the scholarship, and then there was a moment in time when they actually converged for you in your personal life. And that was when you could not disentangle them. Not that you could before, but it was much harder to disentangle the the activism from the scholarship, especially due to the recent events that have been happening in Ghana, but I won't say recent anymore. It's been a couple of years now. And I'm going to ask you to speak more about that in a short time, about what it means to be, to form a group or to be a part of a group like Silent Majority Ghana, and how that shaped your scholarship in turn. But I'm going to start with a more broad question. And so my question for you right now, if I can find my, there it is. So my question for you right now is, so basically many academics have tended to avoid, even in, let's just talk about how we tend to acknowledge, right? We acknowledge the land we're on. We acknowledge that we were a part of the colonial a machine, and we continue to basically exist in this coloniality. And we also acknowledge that we are part of systems of oppression, but then it stops there usually. And we avoid talking about the intersecting role of our own coloniality, our social class or privilege, and how we are a part of, let's just call it American imperialism for now, because I'm thinking also about the universities in North America that we are a part of and what that does or does not do. So in that way, kind of acknowledging that we are sharing this with the people that we study in field work, or we're moving between worlds when participating in different ways of life, that it's not the same as acknowledging our role in the structural violence, nor in committing actions that are we actually committing to actions that are meant to fix the problems that cause the pain and the harm, or that we see being caused or being created. So personally, I found myself asking questions about the relevance of fieldwork in terms, at least for anthropology, whether the people that we study or work with, how much of it is extractive or exploitative. And they've said that to me. Many Ghanaians have said to me, how much of what you're doing is going to benefit me? How much of this is just about you going back to your university and then making a career out of this? And they ask these questions as well, and they're fair questions. So I feel we have to continuously interrogate our motives and the direction of our work. And I want to know where this sits for you. How do you respond to these kinds of questions?
Yeah, it's so fraught, and I really appreciate the question. It reminds me, I was in Ghana a couple of years ago, and I saw one of my interlocutors for the book, and I go up to him and I'm like, hey, what's up? And how's it going? And he's like, what? I never expected to see you again. I thought you were just one of those people who came and then you did your thing and then you left and I would never see you again. And I was like, whoa, I had not anticipated that response because, I'd still been writing. And so I felt very close to all these people. I was like in the data and I was in their interviews and all of these sorts of things. And I had also developed very close friendships with some of the other people I had talked to who had shared like, oh yeah, I remember when this guy came and did his book and he got a lot of wrong in the book anyway, but he never really talks to us, like that sort of thing. So I mean, it's something we constantly have to grapple with. I really think we do. Now, for me, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a sociologist. And I do think that the way that I came into doing qualitative research already kind of put me in a kind of outsider position with this kind of method. And that's because of what I was studying. So the first qualitative study that I did was on whiteness. So I entered into the field as a Black queer person studying middle-class white women. And I remember feeling very vulnerable going out to do this research. Nothing that I had read really entitled me in my embodiment. I'm an African immigrant in the US, kind of going to do this sort of thing, to take on this study. And yet, I had my questions. I wanted to know. I was interested in gender and how it manifested in rugby, in women's rugby. And that's what I thought I was doing. And then I was like, oh, I'm actually doing a study on whiteness, right? So that's how it unfolded. But having that experience, I think really, it felt transgressive for me to be taking up this space, to be doing this research, to be asking these questions of people that are not typically the people that we read about in our class books, right? Like when you, so there are not very many, at least when I was in grad school, I did not read very many books on whiteness, books that were studying middle-class white people. I was always reading books about people of color, often studies that were done by white sociologists. And so having that kind of disconnect between the scholarship that I was engaging with and my own embodiment in the research field, I very early on was starting to ask a set of questions about who was entitled to do this work, what are the ethics of doing it, why are some people more easily moving into space than others. And I took that into my dissertation, which is the research that was the foundation of my book, because now I was switching into engaging with Africans, the normative studied ones. And one of my interlocutors in Houston was like, Anima, it's weird that you're doing this study because I would expect a white person to be doing this study. So even in this context where I expected at least to be more, to be like legible, I was not legible as a researcher. And given how my own positionality interacts with the method, I kind of, and this is not to kind of say, oh, and therefore I'm not also involved in an academic machine, because I certainly am, but I am also trying to kind of tease apart what some of these things can look like. And so I thought about that. I wrote an article in the journal Ethnography titled Invading Ethnography, thinking about my own positionality. The subtitle is A Queer of Color Reflexive Praxis, because I'm really kind of thinking about what it means for minoritized subjects to take up the space of researcher. But then there's the bigger edifice, right? There's the bigger edifice where Temple said to me, I didn't expect to see you again, because I come in with my US pedigree and I'm taking up this space. So I think in a way, it's an ongoing tension, and it's an ongoing kind of like how to navigate all of this in an ethical way. And part of it is being slow, which is also not, we're not in a system that allows for slowness, right? We're not in a system that allows for us to actually build these relationships. And so how do you do that? Like this current study that I'm working on, that I'll talk a bit more about later probably, I've been doing since 2018. And if I hadn't been kind of fast on the last book, I don't have the liberty to be slow because of the demands that the academy imposes on us, which is inherently capitalistic, extractive, and exploitative. So, I mean, in a way, we can do our part, but in the end, there's a kind of abolish the university necessity that allows us to kind of engage in this research in what Gloria Gonzalez Lopez like essentially says, like, and she's got this beautiful essay called it's titled Mindful Ethics, and she says, like, to be a sociologist, that's also a human being, right? That's how she talks about it. And you can't be a human being in academia easily. You can try, but it's not easy. So I feel like those are the ways that I'm like navigating this very fraught position. But there's a way in which I think we need to collectivize and resist the time demands at the very least.
Thanks for that. And I really like what you said about going slow, or the need to slow down, given that we are driven, whether it's a PhD student driven by the time frame of what a PhD should take and funding attached to that, or it's the junior scholar, the pre-tenure scholar who has to reach a tenure and acquire certain, or even the post-tenure scholar to achieve a certain level of accomplishment. Mm-hmm. And I found that it makes you sick. It actually makes you physically ill, and no one acknowledges that. Yeah. And then it also has such an effect on how you view the world and how you view your relationships to people, because you're thinking about what I can. This is where the extraction comes from. It's that mindset right? That we need to be productive, we need to get things done, so we need to get things from people, right? And even though we are human beings who don't want to think of ourselves like that, we're sociologists, we're anthropologists, we're better than that, but we're not, because we're part of this machine, right? And so we're still trying to take as much as we can and saying, but we are nice with you, and we're friends with you, and hey, Charlie, you know, we have relationships that go back. But at the end of the day, sometimes we got to call ourselves out as well, right? And slowing down has been something that I really like the idea of slowing down. So go on.
Yeah, and like I wanted to share this like thing that a couple of weeks ago I went away by myself for the first time in a really long time. I went to a film festival, and it was the weirdest thing, because here I am in space and I'm like, whoa, I'm just talking to people, right? Like I hadn't traveled and just talked. It's like this little thing, right? I hadn't just traveled and talked to people without like needing to like take field notes. I was just being a person. And it really kind of called my attention to how much like doing field research had completely transformed the way that I relate to people. Because often when I travel alone, I'm doing research. And so I'm not just being a normal person. And I don't even fully know what that means, because I'm going off to go do another research trip in 2 weeks. And now I'm like going to be thinking about how I behaved when I was at the film festival and how I am now, because there's a kind of tension that exists in the body when trying to be a researcher. And it's something that I start to reflect on in another article that came out last year called Erotic Ethnography. And in that article, I'm really thinking about what it means to just be a person, and to kind of navigate life as a person when you're not like I don't know, there's this really problematic thing that happens that disconnects us from the way that we engage with each other. And I do think it's those time demands and those productivity, like, yeah, we don't make widgets, but we're definitely making widgets. So, you know, it's definitely part of the struggle here.
So I just want to move on to another question, because firstly, I want to say that I think going slow is a privilege. Not all of us can actually do that. So we need to also acknowledge that. But I've benefited from not rushing. And I mean, and again, I speak from a position of privilege. So my next question is there a line, I guess, where the scholar ends and the activist begins, or are we always both simultaneously? Can we merely be a scholar? And again, I speak from a position where I've been reading, you know, people that I respect, anthropologists, writing about in response to a particular talk that was given at the American Anthropological Association about decolonizing anthropology, and thinking about how anthropology can speak to important political questions that are happening around the world, by Akhil Gupta and another author whose name I need to remember now. But then the response has been, you know, why do we need to think about politics in that way, right? We don't need to respond to politics. But then I find that so this is a question that I've been grappling with, because I mean, so can we merely be a scholar, and does the activist part have to be there? I guess when does it start? When does it end for you?
Yeah, I mean, like, to me, like, that question is so ridiculous. And so that just already begins to kind of like articulate my political position about this, right? Like, so when I teach, like, I tell my students this Marxist aphorism that I really like, that, you know, like, the philosophers study the world. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know why they're studying the world, but the point is to change it. Like, this is how I understand. This is how I understand it. I think so. I mean, you know, what I'm about to say, and all this hedging I'm doing right now is indicative of the political structure that disparages what I'm about to say, which is that my work is political. Like, I do not understand a position in which the work is not political, because the very first studies were political. They were they were created in order to preserve capital, in order to discipline colonized peoples, in order to expect, like, there's no politically neutral study of the world. Like Aristotle was political. Like, so what kind of foolishness really is it to claim that can we just be scholars? I don't think I've ever read a so-called politically neutral piece of work before. So for me, I mean, and even as I'm saying that, like, there are people who claim neutrality all the time, and like their work doesn't matter. And yet they're rewarded, right? It's not like their work doesn't matter and then it goes into obscurity. Unfortunately, it's rewarded. Or like lately I keep like seeing these like wild studies that are just like the clear end goal of the study is to kill all of us. Like, these are not life-affirming studies. These are like, why are you asking this question? What is the goal for asking this question? What happens when you answer this question that is just then going to contribute to the to like environmental decline? Like, you know, and so I'm not even asking this just of like people in the social sciences. I'm also talking about people in the physical sciences as well, or people in economics. There are all these kind of like ridiculous questions that people are asking that are not life affirming. So for me personally, I don't have a divide between those things. I do think that it is really important to have an analysis of the world before you act. So I don't think that we should just go do things. But I do like, study is important. Study helps you understand like the foundations of the problem, the different things that are at stake. This is why scholarship is necessary. But for me, like always, I ultimately have a political project, and that's the project of liberation. There's not a distinction in that for me.
And I guess that's what's interesting, because not all our political projects, if we're all political as scholars, not all our political projects align, right? Mm-hmm. And part of that is because we come from different starting points, different positionalities, even though these change over time, but we don't share let's say, a common goal. And it's when you say that your common goal, I mean, your goal is for liberation, and that would, you know, at times rub against another academic's goal of, let's say, self-accomplishment in a system that they valorize and validate through their participation. And so I guess that this leads to my next question. And, you know, I think you even know what that might be, but so positionality matters for how we do research, right? And I mean, I didn't realize this until I started thinking about my own positionality, both in ways that were affirming because I could identify with other people who felt marginalized or who were minorities in a social political landscape, but also in ways that where I identified as someone who was part of this academic colonial capitalistic machine as well, and who could be doing harm in some ways by, you know, so this is not a straightforward question, but if positionality matters for how we do research and what we research on, how has your own positionality influenced your work and your activism?
Yeah, for me, so like my class location helped me discount a lot of like my more marginalized positionalities. And it's not really something that I was fully aware of. Like, I think more study exposed to me the kind of middle class positionality that even if I pushed back against, still bolstered me, right? And like allowed me to take up certain kinds of spaces, to have certain kinds of questions that, that may seem trivial in certain instances. And so for me, one of the bigger learnings has been to be very conscious. Like, so when I ask a question, I always then have to ask myself, and how is your class informing this question? And it becomes very so like, my first book is about like class privileged people, and that exposed me to things, but also in a kind of perverse way. Like, I was like, oh, these are my people. Like, I hadn't recognized the extent to which these were my people until I engaged in the study. And I'm like, man, y'all are doing some stuff that we really need to kind of think about, right? But now I'm implicated because I understand it further. So like, that's been a growth area for me, really, and that understanding came out of the process of doing this book. But when I think about my positionality more broadly, one of the things I appreciate about thinking about how bodies take up space is the opportunity to form solidarities with so many different kinds of people. Because if I think of myself as an immigrant, I'm not, like, not all immigrants have my background. Some are refugees, some are escaping war, some are what are they called? Like the very rich people who buy their green cards, like, and so it's like, oh, like all immigrants are not the same. So what does it mean to kind of position myself as an immigrant? Like, who am I in solidarity with in this? How do I expand the networks of solidarity within the kind of questions I ask about immigration? How do I take advantage of my own positionality to ask different sets of questions of people who might not be so accessible, right? So what sociologists call studying up. If I think about myself as a queer person, not just in terms of my gender and sexuality, but also in terms of my politics, how does that also then inform the ways that I move? So like the positionality question for me is always has to be about challenging myself and like becoming a bit, sometimes holding up a mirror isn't always pretty, right? And so like kind of recognizing that, but also always being able to like move beyond that to the broader question of, okay, so what are then the social structures that are shaping that positionality? Who does that put you in solidarity with? How does that allow you to speak from a larger position? It's kind of finding that balance between the micro and the meso and the macro, right? Because all of that informs the position. I don't know how much that answers your work, but these are some of the ways that I think about it when I'm trying to move through this question of positionality.
Absolutely. And also, I mean, I know as well, I mean, we can speak about where we come from in terms of how we walk into a room and how we then use our own positionality to interpret and to understand that space, whether it's in our research or in our everyday lives, and how we also move through rooms because of our positionality in ways that someone else cannot move through a room. And so, but also, I also believe that our understanding of our positionalities evolve, they change, they adapt to changes as well. But I think it's the awareness of where we're coming from, which you've perfectly described, as well, being aware of that. And I think some things are just like, your book's a lot about class privilege, right? Mm-hmm. And you're speaking about Africans in the diaspora and in Ghana, so Ghanaians who are class privileged Ghanaians. And so in a way, you're also thinking about class, but at the same time, academics, as we are, or PhD students, sometimes class affects a lot of how we relate to each other, how we relate to the work that we do, but also how we do or do not ask certain kinds of questions, I think. But I'll just leave it at that for now. We can always come back to that. I think that's just my thought right now. I have one more question before we open it up for a Q&A, because I want to hear what people have to say and maybe ask you questions. We have time for that. And I don't want to just us dominate. So, I've got a couple of questions, but I'll just keep them short. I guess I've been thinking more about collaboration. And, the single authored ethnography really does not do it for me anymore. I have written one and I have just finished another, which is obviously, I'm trying to find a publisher, but they're all basically ghosting me. But I find that because all the experts are the ones in the book speaking to me, right? And I am just using theory to mesh their expertise together. And they're already experts and they're already theoretical in their own ways of explaining what's happening in their lives. So I guess I started to think about, okay, what does it mean to collaborate? So, if I don't have to give this talk, the person I spoke to who did this, let's say, political cartoon, or who made this piece for music, is the expert who will speak better than me about this, but I'm somehow making this a scholarly production. I am, in the Said's sense, I'm kind of the expert that, is able to disseminate this knowledge and also control it. For me, I'm thinking more about how do we collaborate? And so what does it mean to you? What does a collaboration mean to you?
Ooh, yeah, I mean, I feel like I have a lot to learn from you on that front, because it is, for me, like I primarily think about myself as a writer, and being a writer is like solitary in that way. Yes, you get all of these, you get all your information, but then the writing element of it is a solitary. I mean, it's not. I write with a writing group, so I don't mean to kind of do like this Thoreau thing, but I do mean that for me, the writing process is a totally different thing. That's not where my question of collaboration comes from, because there are folks that I've been engaged with who really don't want to do something like this, right? It doesn't, even if they understand themselves to be an expert in their own rights. Like, so for example, this current project that I'm doing is a project that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and could take 10 years if I had the funding and the time. But it's about women's football and gender nationalism, but it's also quite about capital and capital's role in like reproducing gender in particular ways, and it's about culture, indigenous cultural practices that have positioned that how indigenous cultural practices have transformed so that women's leisure activities have become more dainty with these kind of colonial ideas about gender and that sort of thing. And I'm still engaging with different people in it, and I'm asking them, so like, what do you want out of this project, right? So there's like that kind of participatory action research element to it. Like, what would you want to see in a study about this? What is something that, people are talking to you all the time, but what haven't they asked you that's important to you? What is an outcome that can be very helpful for you right now? And, sometimes the responses don't align with my own politics. And so it's like, well, maybe I'll connect you with someone, but I can't really help you with that, right? But I do think that there are these other ways, because my job is to write this book, or it's not, whatever. Yes, partly my job, but also like my vocation, right? My calling is to go write this book. And so I don't really have a good answer. And I love, the example you gave of bringing like Bright to come do a talk because he's the expert on the thing. And and I also think, that's like a very particular sort of thing, but how might we, I think it's a really good invitation for me, and I appreciate the question right now as I'm going off to go like hang out with people, but how might we engage in different kinds of collaborative processes? I think of a book by Anna Lara that I really like called Black Sovereignty, Queer Freedom, and part of the collaboration that I see in that book is like the participation in different spiritual practices with the folks that she's engaging with in the research. So I do think that there are different ways that can look, and it behooves us to identify those things. But like, but we have to, because it's also a way of challenging the hegemony of the university of like, this is what knowledge looks like, and this is who the experts are. So what might it mean if we actually, the wretched of the earth kind of position, reframe that in what we produce? And I do think there are spaces in the university that are beginning to accommodate that. So how can we push it further so that we're being more expansive and making our work much more accessible to the people that we care about?
So just to touch on what you said, and just what struck me about what you said was, firstly, how we go about asking questions. I mean, very simple. Field work, we tend to go with the questions that we want to seek answers to or from. And a lot of these questions are driven by either a theoretical starting point or a certain set of readings that we've done, at the university, and now we're going to go out there and seek answers to that particular hypothesis. But I like the way you framed it as well, because I also, I'm a part of this lab called Clear Lab, which is a kind of anti-colonial feminist lab thinking about methodology, right? And one of the ways in which they've started thinking about it is, well, why don't we ask the people that we're talking to what they want to have discussed, right? Why can't the questions come from them and us as a collaboration of what kinds of questions would benefit you? Yeah. Rather than me coming in. And that doesn't work in all cases, I must say, and you're right. If I was speaking, let's say, and I have, to the president of Ghana, and I was interviewing him, I'm not going to collaborate with him because he's the president of Ghana, right? Yeah. I don't necessarily think that he and I would agree on many things. But then again, like someone who's a political cartoonist like Bright, he's doing a PhD in Ghana and he does political cartoons, there is a lot more room for a collaboration. So, I mean, I don't think collaboration is always the go-to answer, right? Because the power is involved as well. Yeah. But I do think we can ask questions based on what people also, and have that conversation about what they think is a good question, and I appreciate that. I'm going to open it up for questions, but so as you think about your questions for Anima, you can either raise your hand, you can put it in the chat, and in the meantime, I want to ask a last question, which will just allow you to segue into the Q&A, which is, can you speak a little bit? It's not a question. Can you speak a little bit about your role as an activist? Because I mean, we haven't spoken a lot about what activism is for you. Silent majority Ghana. I mean, I am. Also was something that was something that I was also excited by, and seeing things that were being mobilized outside of Ghana and also from within Ghana. Can you talk a bit about your activism while people think about other questions?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. So Silent Majority Ghana is actually Silent Majority Ghana is going through some changes, and I'll be happy to talk a bit more about that. But it began as a collective. So back in February of 21, an LGBT center was shut down in Ghana, and I was really, like, it just kept getting worse and worse. When I would go, every time I'd go online, the news was getting worse. And I'm talking about within the course of a day. I'm not talking about within the course of a few days. And as I was saying earlier, when I was doing my research, what I really came to understand was that even though there's this kind of dominant discourse that Ghanaians, as a totality, are opposed to queer people and want to see us dead and all of these horrible things, when I was doing my research, I was really understanding something different. I was having these intimate conversations. People were talking about how they understood, we're talking about how, like, they recognize queer people as one of them, right? And so, but they were just too afraid to speak out. And so I wanted to say something, and it occurred to me that I'm just one person, like, nobody knows me. I don't have any pull anywhere. But a collective voice, that'll make a difference. So I reached out to a few people, and then they reached out to people. And then very quickly, we had circulated a letter, and we got, like, I don't know, like something like 1,200 signatures or something within a very short amount of time. And it just kept building. Like, so we were like, okay, there's some momentum here. Let's keep going. Let's keep talking. And then we started we were writing a lot. a lot of us were in the academy or were engaged in different kind of writing projects. And we were writing a lot. We were doing a lot of education. We were engaged in interviews that were pushing people, having them to think differently about things. And so, but for me, my role when I first called these people together, I was perhaps thinking like, oh, this is activism. But I was also organizing, right? Like gathering people, calling folks together, strategizing different kinds of responses. And the truth is that the moment came at it, like I was well suited for that moment because somewhere in the few years before, I had been building my acumen as an organizer and as an activist. I took classes with BOLD, which is Black Organizers for Leadership and Development. I read a lot of books about organizing and doing political activist work. And it's not because I was anticipating this. It was more of a, I'm curious about these things. And I don't know. Maybe my ancestors were like, look, you need to be ready for this moment. I don't know. But for whatever reason, I had developed quite some skills, because I don't think this is just something that you just do. Some people do as they, or learn as they do, but like people have been thinking very seriously about this. And so if we take study seriously, which I do, then this also became necessary for me to take that seriously. And so for the last 2 years, and less so in the last year, but silent majority for reasons that include my job at the university, which pulled me away from the kind of more urgent work on the ground. Silent majority has been engaged in different kinds of activities, but it's largely been around political education. And I feel well suited to be doing the work of political education because I am a teacher. And because of how I understand education, like for me, I learned from Freire and Bell Hooks about education as a practice of freedom. And so that's the orientation with which Silent Majority has been moving. And currently, I've actually registered the organization as a nonprofit, and in the process of formalizing the political education approach, which is anti-colonial, queer, feminist, African, kind of rooted in these indigenous practices. But it's been really challenging. It's been a growth area. It's been wonderful to be in community with other people who are invested in this. And the community just expanded and expanded once the work began. I mean, that's how Girish and I met. And so it's serious work, and it's not always work that can be easily combined with the work of being a professor. And it reminds, actually, I knew this question was coming, and there was a quote that Du Bois has this quote from his memoir. He's reflecting on his proximity to lynching. Some man has just been lynched, and he was writing a letter to take to the post office. And by the time he got to, some man had just been accused of murdering his white landlord's wife. And Du Bois was writing a letter, and by the time he gets to the post office to drop off the letter to the newspaper, the man has been lynched. And this is what he said. So I want to read that. He said, 2 considerations thereafter broke in upon my work and eventually disrupted it. First, one could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. And secondly, there was no such demand for scientific work of the sort that I was doing, as I had confidently assumed would be easily forthcoming. And like that, one cannot be cool, calm, and detached. Like the things that we're told are urgent are just not urgent. Like there's urgent things. And so there's this kind of complete disconnect between the reality of the world we're living in, and we're dealing with this assault on the humanities and social sciences, the political assault from very powerful people. And, it's just kind of very distracting. And I think about that a lot. How to continue to do my job because it pays my bills, allows me to have internet. And and also how to do this urgent work that, that's largely uncompensated. So, I mean, it's not a happy ending, but it's an ongoing process. And I think that's important.
That's actually very powerful, that quote. And I think there's a lot to say about it, but I'm going to not say too much at the moment, just to say that we are inviting as many people as in the room who have questions for Anima to either put their questions in the chat or to raise their hand and ask the questions themselves, with or without the video. Is completely up to you. You're also free to turn on your videos, if that is something, so we can see you. Should I read out one of the questions, Anima? I'm sure you can see it too, but I'll read it out because when it's recorded, we can't see the chat. So this is from Marie Aminata. Could you please speak to how you make sure research participants are able to get something out of your research projects? As an early days PhD student, I'm often worried about not being able to financially compensate my participants. Would you like to start with that first?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I'm sure it's very difficult to kind of figure that out because you don't have any money. And so how are you going to pay people? So I'll say that for me, when I first started doing research, qualitative research, my thesis advisor was like, we don't pay participants. So that's what I learned, right? It was just like, and her kind of approach to it was that, I mean, she had like these ideas. Interviews are a middle-class methodology. So like already there's this assumption that the people you're talking to are middle-class people who don't need your $20 gift card to Starbucks or whatever. But also she had this other concern that that paying your interlocutors kind of sullied the transaction of the interview, that exchange, because it made it like about a monetary exchange. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I have never compensated my interlocutors, in large part because I don't have money. And if I were to spend time, I have to be very honest that if like having to pay the people I talk to do the work became a prerequisite, I don't know how much of the work would get done, because the kind of work I do is I've had some luck with funding, but it's not very easy to fund. It's not that it's not easy to fund, like people just don't want to fund it, right? So it's like, if that's part of the issue that I'm confronting, then how am I supposed to pay for it? Because I do ethnographic work, I find these other ways of being involved in the communities that I'm part of. So for example, when I was in Houston, part of what I did was help out with events. So, like there's one event where I was a DJ. I'm not a DJ, but it was just like, hey, Anima, put some music on, right? Or I'll show up early and set up tables and that sort of thing. Oh, you want me to take care of your kid? I'll do that. So these are soft things, right? But it's also part of relationship building. In the current study that I'm doing, it's really, for me, my work in this area has been about relationships. I don't get paid for it aside from being a professor. And I explain to people that, I'm interested in this. This is what I hope it'll do. Are you interested? Like, there's no coercion here. But I also do see the value. Like, I have a friend who's doing a study right now with trans women in California, and they got a lot of money, so they pay their interlocutors. I think if you have the money, pay them. But if you don't, I also think we cannot overly rely on money as the only means of giving them something to get out. The language that you used, how do they get something out of it? Because yes, money is important. I'm not dismissing that at all. And we are also human beings who have a lot of other needs. And so how do we ask folks? Like, sometimes it's just like, what can be good for you? Like, some of my interviews were done over lunch. I can buy you lunch. So just kind of really thinking a bit more expansively about what that something can look like, and in conversation with your interlocutors, being able to determine that. I hope that's helpful. You're muted, Girish.
Sorry, thanks, Anima. I like to add, and so they say that's very helpful, and thank you. I like to add as well that there is, I've been, so One Love, Anima, and so he's a very big part of my book. And when we were at a radio interview in Accra in December, at the end of the interview, he kind of turned to me, or at least he texted me this later and said, I'm still wondering about what the people in your book will get back from your book, because we're all in there, but what kind of compensation do we get, in terms of equity? And, and then I'm like, I don't make any money from this book as well. But I told him, I said, if this book is, if it makes $5, I'm going to try and distribute it as well as I can. But that's, again, a question that we don't have easy answers to. But these are important questions to be asked, not just because, I never thought about it till he said, well, what do we get from this? Yeah. It's not just us talking to you, but what we, of course, there's a friendship, but we can't fall back on that. We can't just say we have a friendship, because in some cases, a friendship can also be about power relationships, and it's not always, as we know, equal. I see people in the chat. Anyone else asking questions? Raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask a question.
And while folks are thinking about questions, I'll also add, depending on the work. So for Afropolitan Projects, I asked folks if they wanted me to identify them, and some of the people are culture creators. So it's like, I'm not going to make a whole lot of money of this. I mean, I've spent more of my own money getting the book done than anything else. But it's like, if I'm going to name you, if people read the book, maybe they'll look you up. And I say that in the acknowledgement of the book, like, maybe look up these people. Maybe you can go patronize their work, like look up this artist. So those sorts of things are also ways of giving back. But I do hope that research can be also about building community and collaboration in ways that kind of challenge this narrow thing. So I don't think it's a bad question to ask, like you're saying. And I hope that the way that we answer it do not necessarily kind of reproduce these systems of transaction in our relationships.
Exactly. Any other questions? Maybe while we wait, I can ask another question to you, which I've been, I have many questions, but I've been thinking more about how we can never truly decolonize academia, whether it's sociology, which is what I did, a undergraduate degree in sociology, which then led me to anthropology, which I found was even more colonially fraught. And so I find that we can never truly decolonize, especially in a North American context where we are all more or less who are not indigenous, we are all settlers, and where land has, constantly being appropriated and stolen and never properly returned. But I want to say, how can we, because you spoke about abolition, you spoke about how your activism is about abolition. Do you make distinctions between your work as abolition and, because we've spoken a little bit about decolonizing, some of academia, or even Christianity, as we once had that conversation. How do you see your work as being about decolonization or not, or perhaps so different from that?
Yeah, I really love that question, because I don't think I've thought them together like that before. So it's funny, because when I think about decolonizing the university, I was like, Sylvia Tamale's work is really instrumental for me in my thinking about this. And Tamale's primarily interested in the African university, which, oh my God, can we talk about a colonized space, right? Not even just the university, the landscape of African education. I mean, I did my schooling up through primary school in Ghana, and I was the most British subject there was, right? And so there's just there's this kind of very basic way in which we can be engaged in transforming these systems. And I'm currently reading Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America. And so it's coloring a lot of my thinking right now because it's my current obsession. It's a big book, it takes up all your time. And one of the things that I'm taking from it right now is how like abolition never happened, right? Like, and I'm talking about abolition of slavery, right? Like because there was resistance to that all the way, like from the very beginning. And he has this quote that stayed with me. It was something about like, if we don't have a radical transformation of the system, we're always going to be doing a patchwork of fixes, and it'll never change. And I don't know why that. This is something I've understood intellectually, but there's something about reading it so close to the source, and the materiality of it kind of resonates in a very deep way. So when I think about the university, I do not have a optimistic outlook on the university. I want the university to be a certain way. I want the university to be a space in which folks can engage in the kind of deep learning that I have been able to experience, that has transformed me and shaped the way that I'm able to understand the systems of inequality, to find hope, to build community. Like, this is what I want the university to be. This is not what the university is. The university is a neoliberal capitalist machine that kind of draws students in and says we need to give them degrees so that, I mean, I think I don't know what it's called in the US, the Minister of Education, whatever that position is, recently said that like the purpose of going to college is so that you can get a job. Like what? Like, to me, that's wild. Like, that can't be the purpose of going to college. Then just go do on-the-job training. And so if this is the system, we kind of need to throw it away and create a new one. So that's what I think. And then of course, like here I am in the university, and I mean, it's hard, and I'm trying to be cautious about how I speak, because I don't want to be taken out of context. But essentially, this kind of investment, this realization that the system is untenable, and needs to be undone is part of like the struggle that I live with every day. And I know I'm not alone in this. There's so many spaces in which kind of thinking about the abolition of the university along with the capitalist system and the prison system are all at play. So I see more questions. I'll stop here because I don't even have a clear bow tie on this.
Well, I see a hand raised. Wellesley, Wellesley, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, can you hear me all right? Hi, everyone. Hi, Anima. Thank you for sharing your thoughts today, and for Laura and Girish for organizing this, of course. I maybe just to also piggyback on your response, thinking about university and how to be in it as an educator. I saw on your website that you also facilitate community workshops and other sorts of trainings. And I guess my question, is coming from a place where I'm now towards the end of my PhD and I'm beginning to teach my own classes, thinking about my own sort of like pedagogical practice, and I've organized various forms of writing workshops before, and now I'm trying to like integrate some of that into like the more typical university undergraduate education space. I'm just wondering how, like, what's been possible for you in different formats of workshops that you've organized, and in more community spaces or in professional spaces versus in the university. I'd just be curious to hear how you, like, in your practice as a facilitator, like what you try to do in those different spaces and how that might relate to both your scholarship and also your activism.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I appreciate it. It's facilitating workshops is one of my favorite things that I do. It's it's a wonderful way to engage in teaching for me. I find that when people sign up for the workshops that I do, or usually I don't like advertise a workshop. They seek me out to give a workshop, but there's an investment in the work in a very particular kind of way that I'm able to accomplish at some point in the classroom, right? Like, students take time, like adjusting to you, deciding if they're going to trust you. But then at some point, this happens in the classroom and it's very magical and it's exciting. And the workshops I do are usually no more than 3 hours long. And so far, they've all been virtual. And I think that, and I'm saying that because I think that does change a little bit the shape of it. I've done a few that have happened over the course of a few days. But all of what I like about those spaces is, well, at a very base level, like nobody's there for a grade, right? People are there because they're genuinely interested. And usually like people have paid to be part of it, or someone's paying for it. And so there's like a different kind of like, you're really there because you want to be there and you're invested in the questions that we're talking about and asking. And I found that such robust thinking and sharing happens, and the diversity of thoughts, like the different kinds of people that I've been in these spaces with, is always so beautiful, because part of what it does is that it challenges the dominant discourse that like only like-minded people want to have this conversation, right? Or that like there's this narrow view. And yet, like, I mean, I've had people who are investment bankers and people who are high-level Navy officers in conversation with me about queer freedom. And that's such a beautiful thing, because for me, it's very encouraging. It reminds me that this political struggle is not one that's only for those of us who are queered by the systems of oppression or whatever, but that it's like we can really share this broad, we can be broadly invested in this, even as people are coming at it from different spaces. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I do think a big part of how I engage it is through this kind of like bell hooks, education as a practice of freedom, Paulo Freire. Like, these are the people that taught me. I've learned a lot from organizers and how they set up their spaces. Like, I don't think my classroom looks like a traditional college classroom, just because I prefer to do it a different way, and I found that it really works out well. We build a community, we work together, and that energy is kind of reproduced in the workshops as well. Thanks for your question.
Laura, you
Thank
have
you.
a question as well. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for this talk. It's so super powerful. Then one thing that I was thinking during your talk, it's like how like can we define activism? Because at the same time, like I'm coming from Brazil, and then I'm from anthropology, and then in Brazil in anthropology, like I mean in this new generation, there is like any like a super like different perspectives about this issue of like activism. Like if you arrive in Brazil like in the and you talk like in the new generation of anthropologists about like, oh, there's like a border between activism and like what you're doing in academia. People will say like, what do you mean? Like, it's obviously that we need to be like activists, like in the places that, and also with people that are we working with. So this is not like something that people spend like a lot of time thinking. And then for me it's like something really different when I arrived here, because I was like having contact with different perspectives about, because in Brazil it's kind of maybe implicit that there's obviously that we need to think about this place, and also we need to think about any, I don't know, return to the people that we work with. So I have like a bunch of friends that work, for example, in Amazon with indigenous people there. And there's this issue that that if you are going to Amazon, you probably need to bring like gasoline with you together, because like the indigenous people will need like to put gasoline in their boats, this kind of thing. So, but my point is like about this definition of activism is also because, as you said, like there is no neutral acknowledgement. So we know that. And also I think like theory is also this speculative place. Like, I mean, like this place where we can imagine like collectivities, create audience, also imagine body, nation, this kind of things. So I don't know. I was thinking maybe when we try to like when we as like queer people or Black people, indigenous people, women, this kind of things, when we are in academia, putting like our existences there, do you think that in certain way we are doing like a kind of counter activism? Like I don't know, because I think like this big theories with this like super European and white guys, they are also engaging in producing an word. They are also engaging in producing like notions of identity, notions of nations. So it's like an activism too. So I was thinking like the activism that we are doing, it's like kind of counter activism. Like I don't know, I don't know if maybe, I don't know, just wondering.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. And it's really like an interesting concept to think about it as like counteracting the activism of like the dominant perspective, right? I mean, I have this kind of ambivalent relationship to like actually challenging power, which is that like they're gonna do what they'll do, and we need to do what we'll do. So I don't necessarily like, because there's a way in which for me, the way that I approach these things is that if we play according to the terms of the existing debate, then we're always enthralled to them, right? So why don't we expend our energy imagining and creating the worlds that we want? But something that you said about taking gasoline out into the Amazon, for example, I really like that, because part of what you're talking about is reciprocity. And it goes back to the very first question about like, what do we get out of it, right? Because like, it's this, I feel like we have customs and traditions that help us build relationships with one another. And knowing that the space that I'm entering, this is a space in which I can bring you gasoline. It sounds like a very simple thing, but it makes such a big difference, right? And so it's like, well, at least you know that when I show up, I'm not just going to come and like eat your food and like whatever the case is, but I'm also going to bring you gasoline. And then we'll get in the boat together and we'll go buy a fish, and then we'll go catch a fish, and then we'll eat together. It's like these very like small things that are also part of the relationships we're building, and everybody does this. But sometimes because of the unequal power dynamics, like the stakes are higher in these different places. So like I hear what you're saying about counteractivism, and I think it's important work, because like, these people need to be told about themselves. But I also like, for me, I'm very invested in just kind of like, what are we actually trying to do? How do we expend, we have limited energy, so how do we expend that in building the worlds we're trying to create? But I love that story a lot. It's going to stay with me. So thank you.
I mean, also, I think we've come to learn, or at least I've come to learn, is that there's certain things you can't change, at least not in, like, don't try and convince the people who don't want to be convinced. Otherwise, work on what you can actually work on to make that change in the spaces that you can actually help, or I mean, not say help in the kind of a savior mentality, but to actually participate in the rebuilding of things that are already in action, right? But I wanted to say we have 3 questions. So we have Sarah. So can we take Sarah's question, and then I'm going to read the other 2 questions on the chat together, back to back.
Thanks so much. Thanks for this talk. It's been really great. I had a question for you. I'd like to know your if you have any advice, your experience of when you were on the job market. I'm at the very end of my PhD. I also currently have a postdoc, so I am on the job market, and I've had some success, some not success, but I find that, especially now, there's just this push in anthro, and I think in across multiple disciplines that focus on like social inequality, is that they want you, there's just so much more is expected of you as someone coming out with a PhD, that you have to do, you have to jump through the hoops of getting the PhD, writing the dissertation, but you also have to have top journals published. But now you also need some sort of like public engagement, community engagement. And so it's not like, they want more community engagement, more public engagement. It's just something on top of it, right? With equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is, good, but also it's just a lot now. And, you're expected to be coming out of this PhD with everything, right? With an entire, project of community engagement, and where it's just really hard. And you have to also publish with, there's this expectation that you're also speaking with the people that you do research with already after like just literally having the PhD. And it's just a lot. And, it's a huge struggle. So yeah, I was just wondering if you had some sort of, advice for folks, because it's not like the, the big journal, like the big publishing single authored papers are like seen as not as important anymore. It's just adding to this list of things required. Yeah, I just wanted to know if you had any insight, advice, experience for those of us struggling right now.
So Anima, do you want to just answer that first, and then I'll ask the two questions back to back after this?
Yeah, Sarah, it's horrible. Like, that's the first thing. Like, it's really horrible. And like, I think you articulated it so well. Like, there's just this constant demand for more and more and more. Honestly, well, I'll tell you, like, and actually what I'll say is, and there is no guarantee that even if you did all those things, you would get a job. And it is from that position that I am speaking now. Consider other things. Like, it's very demoralizing, but it's just, there's like, you can do everything in the world. My first job, which was at a small college in Boston, I had like 3 or 4 peer-reviewed publications when I left grad school, and God knows what else, right? Had 300 applicants. Like, that's ridiculous. So, and that was 6 years ago. I would think about other things, because it's just, the system is untenable, and I wish I had something more encouraging to say, but it's just the truth. I say to my students, look, check out Versatile PhD, spend some time on idealist.com, just really think about other places where you can, because you need a job. Like, because if you didn't need a job, like, you would just, keep doing what you're doing, right? But you need a job. And given that reality, like, begin to expand. And I don't even say that in this kind of like, oh, alt-ac is the way to go and you'll make more money, whatever. No, I'm just talking about the basic reality of needing a job, and academic jobs keep getting worse. It's not like, even if you got one, it would necessarily be a life-affirming job. So I would really encourage you to have other things in mind as well, even as you pursue this. And like, go bowling with your friends sometimes, because it's not going to make any difference, and at least you'll have fun. So I'm sorry, I really wish I had something much more encouraging, but alas, this is just the reality of the system.
We have 5 minutes left, and we have a couple of questions in the chat. Sarah says she hates bowling, so she's going to find something else to do with her friends. So the two questions, and I think they might be related. So the first question is from Adriana. What has activism taught you about structuring courses and teaching classes? And Este, he really appreciates the discussions on positionality and extractive logics of research. It's an early PhD student starting academia after a decade of working in human environmental rights work in I won't say this correctly because I won't know the pronunciation, Ixim Uliu, Guatemala. I find a lot of discomfort with the pressure of performing and displaying knowledge and originality. I posted something about this idea of firsting, that somehow academics need to be the first to think about something new. It is colonial. It is so colonial. So read Max Liboiron on that as well. And much of this comes from the context of knowing the urgency of needs on the ground, where people are dying and fending off Canadian mining and plantation systems of Euro-American import. So any tips you can provide for those of us starting our projects so we can stay the course in balancing the demands imposed by academic settings and honoring the needs of the communities that sustain us? I'll leave it at that. It's a big question, and there are two questions. I'll leave it with you to see how you want to respond.
All right, thank you. So the first question I will, I'm kind of rehearsing, but the best classrooms for me, and so I learned this from my teachers and then incorporated and then also figure out like what's for me. And so I don't even necessarily think that it's about activism in that way, because it's iterative. It's like in these kind of like organizing spaces, these are the things that work. This is what I learned in the classroom. This is what works. And then it kind of moves back and forth. But at the base of it for me is building community. At the very base of my classroom, like, yes, you're supposed to teach things, right? Like you're supposed to teach things. And I take that very seriously. I don't say it that way to kind of dismiss it. But the learning isn't going to happen if there isn't that trust and that rapport and that kind of connection. And it shows up in my teaching reviews. I don't put much stock in them, but still there's this particular thing that shows up in my teaching reviews about how they felt a sense of community with one another. And I'm not talking about like 12 people classes either, right? Like 60-person classes. I think, and so which is to say, if you can do it in 60, you can do it in 12. But really kind of leading from this place of like, we are now a community of scholars. We are students together. And I think that really helps because it makes the stakes personal to each of us, and then people can share how they're coming in. And I really feel like that that expands on the learning and shares power in a very different sort of way. Like ultimately, I have to take responsibility in the classroom. I am the professor, and also I don't think you're an empty vessel that I'm pouring into. So how do we kind of like navigate that? So that's I feel like that kind of respect that I accord my students is also the same kind of respect that I accord in that I extend in my organizing spaces, and we're able to share that. I think I'm a really bad person to answer this next question, and here's why. I do what I want. So it's not good advice because I think like part of the question was like about honoring, like balancing the demands imposed by the academic setting. There's so many of those demands, and some of them are frankly dumb. I don't know how else to say it. So for me, like the way that I've done it is to really kind of stand at a distance and determine like which of these things are existential, right? Like, what do I actually need to do to be able to move through this system so that I can do the thing that I actually need to do? And there can be negative implications to orienting yourself that way. You might not Well, actually, no. So what I was taught was do your work really, really, really well. Like that's the first thing. Make sure you do your work really, really, really well. Not about the originality. There is a kind of way in which it also means like always turning the question on the head, resisting the landscape or the terrain on which you're supposed to engage these questions, and being explicit about why. Like, I'm not doing this because I don't think it's valuable to the work that I'm trying to do. But kind of like, to me, Esther, it sounds like you have a very clear sense of why you're doing this. Keep that and then keep doing it. Become adept at recognizing what's just noise that you can cast aside. Become adept at recognizing what's an opportunity you can capitalize on in order to take advantage of that thing so that you can do your work, and then do your work. I don't even think I'm saying anything particularly like deep here, but it is like, don't get caught in the academic trap, and just do your work. I feel like that's the balance. And I'm going to read the article that Girish you put, because yeah, we're not saying anything original. Everything we say we learned from our interlocutors, and so like, we have to be honest about that.
I agree. I think also, like, stop comparing yourself to other academics. Do your thing. Be you. You're in your own research, your own situation, and you're creating your own relationships. Not to replicate or try to be another person who somehow is doing this amazing thing, because that's, I don't think that's the best way to do scholarship. But I want to say that we're at 2:31 and we have reached the end of our 90 minutes. And I want to also say, on behalf of myself, also UFT Anthropology, and the Ethnography Lab, thank you so much, Anima, because this conversation is so important. It's also a conversation that I know we could have with you in a way that would really benefit all of us. And you really brought a wonderful, you brought yourself, and you brought a wonderful, engaging conversation to this topic. Does Wes or Laura have anything to add before my cat wants to show you his body, just so that you know he's here? Yes, go on, Laura.
Oh my God, it's so cold. I just would like, thank you so much. It's like super amazing conversation. It's honor have you here, Anima. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to hear you. That's so precious. And also thank you everyone that was here with us. Thank you so much. This is like a part of a series of conversations that we're gonna do in Ethnolab. So we will like continue doing another talk related to ethnography and also other issues in anthropology like ethics, gender, sexuality, and also about field work, research, this kind of things. So we're gonna like do the divulgation when those other events are coming. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Thanks, Anima. I will talk again soon. And
Yes,
enjoy.
thank you all. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.